I'm Andy Oram, and I work for O'Reilly Media, and I'm editing a book called Shipping Greatness, a very interesting book written by Chris Vander Mey, who is with me now. And
Hi, Andy.
we're going to talk a bit about interesting things that Chris has done. You have worked, among other places, at Amazon.com and Google.
Yeah, that's right. I was an engineering manager at Amazon.com. I worked in the community division, which means that I did things like built reputation systems to figure out which reviews are the best, which customers are trustworthy enough to be able to upload customer images of products and so forth. And at Google, I worked on a number of products, amongst them Google Pack. I shipped the Google Photos screensaver, which is a funny little product. I shipped the Google Apps Marketplace. I built the Google Apps Sync for Microsoft Outlook, which enables you to use Outlook as a client for Google Apps. I also shipped the Hangouts product. I was responsible for bringing that multi-way video product to market.
Which is very similar to the software that we're using right now, though not exactly the same.
It is similar, yes.
Yeah. So there was one, I'll start with something that seems to be rather small and subtle, but I thought it was very indicative of your philosophy. You were talking about giving a presentation, which of course millions of people have written on, books, blogs, all kinds of places, but you said one of the most important things to do is to listen during a presentation. Could you describe why you said that?
In this context, well, overall, it's a good idea to listen, right? Stephen Covey is responsible for sort of coining this phrase, seek first to understand and then to be understood, which I think is very, very important. There are many, and that's kind of a mature thing to do. It takes a bunch of growing up to be able to actually understand and then attempt to communicate. But in the context of the book, I think, in which we're talking about this, the scenario is when you're working with executives, when you're working with your management, when you're working with people that have the ability to say yes or no to your product, or have a deep insight into your software. And so, this could be your venture capitalists, it could be close advisors. Generally, when you get that limited amount of time, what's very, very important is that you capture word for word actually what people say. When you're in the heat of the moment and you're presenting yourself, you're presenting your product, generally you're very engaged in what you're doing and you care a lot about it. The actual words that you hear are frequently different than what was actually said. So it's really important, I believe, to take verbatim notes, write down exactly what was said, and ideally to have somebody else doing that for you so that you can continue to engage with the person who's speaking. And what this does is this enables you to come back either immediately after the meeting and say, okay, so you said X, Y, and Z, and we're going to go away and we're going to talk about that. We're going to come back with something, and then follow up, days, hours, weeks, months later with very specific responses to that. And that's A, a sign of respect. B, it gives you the most value out of that meeting that you could have. And C, it avoids disasters. And a lot of what shipping software is about avoiding disaster, right? Like basically you've got a high probability that something terrible will happen at some point and will cause a big delay. One potential source of this is when you've got somebody who cares a lot about what you're doing or about their company or about whatever it may be. And if you miss that little bit of nuance, they very well may say, no. Please do not do what you're doing until you fix this. I think it's very important.
Is there an example you can give where someone made a major change in direction that way?
Well, I will say when I worked on the Google Photos screensaver, I had this wonderful meeting with Larry and Sergey, and at the time I didn't think it was really that wonderful because we were ready to ship the product, and I was there with my tech lead at the time, and we built this product that we've been asked to build, and it looked good and so forth, and And Larry said something like, it seems a little slow. And we said, well, it's running at about 90% CPU. And because it was moving a whole bunch of images around the screen. And he said, well, that doesn't seem right. And we said, to make this work with DirectX would be a lot more engineering, and we're just actually doing everything in software. We weren't doing any hardware acceleration. And Larry said, well, that doesn't seem right. You should go do that. And we said, we just came to tell you we were shipping it. We didn't actually come to get some advice on it per se. And Larry said, no. And we said, well, Larry, and we did, one of the things that I generally suggest, which is to try to classify things into, launch blocking, or can we do it just, like a couple weeks maybe, can we just get it out there and then we'll fix it later? And Larry said, no, you really need to do this before you launch it. And so we said, okay, we will do that. And so we got some very clear, we got that very clear feedback. We took it in, and we avoided, in this case, it kind of was a disaster. And at the same time, it's hard to argue with him. He was right. He wants to spend more money to make it better. That's great. I happened to be lucky enough to work with a just really fantastic engineering team that was able to make things happen much more quickly, and we did a series of things to accelerate the process. But that's a situation in which we listened carefully, and we had to take a change.
Well, that made me think of something interesting about Google and perhaps some other companies that work on services. I don't think you have quite the same approach to deadlines that the old-fashioned computer and software companies had, where they promise something.
I think that's basically right. Although I will say, on some of the software I've worked on, there are hard deadlines. One of the general bits of advice I'd give would be, if you can avoid a deadline that you have to make, like the Super Bowl, or in my case, for example, we had planned for the Google Apps Marketplace launch, we planned to launch an event called Campfire One, which is a series of events that Google started doing. And that meant that we had to announce that well in advance, because we were going to have all these reporters and journalists and bloggers and so forth coming to Google. And so we had a big event and food and all that stuff. You can't just move that date. And what that means is your launch has to happen right then, at that time, and it had better doggone well work. Other events that are similar to that are like Google I/O or Apple's WWDC. So when you have one of those events, you just really don't have a choice. When you don't have one of those events, your life is so much nicer. Because to the extent that your team can agree on a date, you should have that. Dates are great forcing functions. They inspire action and so forth. But being able to say, okay, we're going to start rolling it out on Tuesday, and if it all goes well, we'll go to 20%, and we'll go to 40%, and so on and so forth. That's actually really, really useful for the team, because the team can pull things back before you cause great problems or so forth. One of the key themes that I take away, and I credit to a product manager that I know, Aaron Abrams, who says, successful rollback is not a failure. And I think he's right. If you can put your product out there and it doesn't quite work, and you roll it back and everybody's okay, then you haven't failed yet. Failure is when you roll it out there and you delete everybody's data and there's no way to get back. Uh-huh. So that's failure. And so generally what I would say is that there are frequently, regardless of your size, small companies have to work towards, their board of directors, trying to get like the next round of funding. You set internal deadlines. You've got things like, I want to get this done before, the end of the year because everybody's going on vacation, that type of thing. Those are real deadlines. And then there are events, conferences, and so forth that you have to work towards. So I think everybody suffers from deadlines to some degree, and part of what makes your software great is knowing when you do have a hard deadline and knowing how to work towards that and mitigate your risk. And the other end of it is avoiding them when possible.
One thing I was thinking about reading Shipping Greatness was what a launch is like. And it sounds like it made me think about the old War Games movie where people are wondering if the world's going to blow up in 10 minutes and making decisions. Could you give me a feeling for what it's like to be in the room when there's a launch?
Sure. Yeah, Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy, what a great movie. I love that film. I think systems have come a long way since the Whopper, so it's a little bit easier to deal with things nowadays. I think that there are multiple ways in which launches happen. I just told you a little bit about the launch of the Google Apps Marketplace. And so we had a bunch of executives up in front of people live streaming across the web and demonstrating things. And then in a room next door, we had a couple of PR folks. And in Seattle, we had an engineering team, and everybody was on IM. And we said, okay, guys, it's time. Start turning it on. And they said, okay. And so they started rolling things out. And, I was there on IM, and I was IMing people because I wasn't able to be with the engineering team at that time. It's something I miss. It's actually kind of fun being with the engineering team because even though it's a small, even though relatively few things happen, you push a couple buttons, you bounce a series of servers, things happen. It still is fun to sort of go through that experience with the team. If you can't be part of that experience with the team and sort of be through that exciting moment, the next best thing is to, you absolutely got to make sure the team understands the excitement from, the other side. If the team has to be there to handle the engineering side of things and they can't be at, say, a press event or whatever, they need to understand that excitement. So you got to bring them in to the extent you can by sending them email, by bringing them photos, by bringing them back swag. I brought back a whole bunch of T-shirts from the event with the team. I actually tried to bring back a chair, but it was a little too large. And then celebrating it afterwards and making sure that the team, marks that milestone. Very important. In another case, I remember when we launched one of our products earlier on that I was able to sit. There was a case where at Amazon, the team was really stratified in this sort of strange way where the engineers all knew that they had to very carefully watch the metrics, and they were watching how the servers were doing, and they were watching how users were adopting the product, and they could see the growth, and they were watching, measurements and so forth. But like some of the program management and some of the folks associated with the project were all in another room, like having pizza and celebrating, and that to me was really dysfunctional. I don't think it's good to have like, yay, we're having a party. And I asked the PM in charge, I said, well, how are things going? And he said, well, they're going good. We got pizza, we got food. And I was like, how many users are using it? And they sort of looked at me like, I don't know. And so I happened to know who the tech lead was, and I walked over and I said, Erin, how are things? She's like, they're fine. I got she had a dashboard of like 15 charts. I was like, thank God somebody has their eye on the ball. So if you're that person who's, got your eye on the ball and is watching all that stuff and knows, and has a high level view, you're the person who's shipping that software. It's not the person, it's not the senior manager who's like, toasting and having, and having pizza. It's the person with all the dashboards.
It sounds like some engineers felt like, well, the integration testing was done and we rolled it out and so we're done. They didn't think about the people on the other end, as you were saying.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. There's a series of things you need to do immediately after you hit the button to sort of flip the bits and roll your software out, whether it's, uploading your app to the Apple App Store or, pushing a new version to your web servers. You need to monitor your customer forums. You need to look at things like, how slow is our system? You need to make sure that you aren't getting a huge number of sign-on errors. All these basic things, your job is not done. And that's one of the reasons why, I say that you should absolutely celebrate your launch, get yourself some champagne, do it like 3 days after. It's close enough that, that it still counts. But, you don't want everybody like a little tipsy as they're desperately trying to, hunt some crazy bug that's messing with people's data, or or if you have to roll back. You want to get yourself into a good, stable place, and I think that's important. The team will appreciate the celebration just as much, 2-3 days later.
I want to turn to a couple of more technical parts of the book. I think there's some interesting things you say about some of the technologies. One thing you suggest is to create an API very early on and show it to management. And I wonder how that helps with the acceptance or with the planning.
Well, I think this is absolutely 100% relevant in companies where you will have other companies integrating with you. I have this company right now called Scaled Recognition. We do text and face and object recognition. And so one of the very first things I did was write what the API would be. And it was as simple as recognize face and pass in an image. And I said, okay, if we can do this and we'll get back some data about that face, great. Similarly, when you're working in a larger company, you sort of have to treat those different parts of the company as if they're different businesses. And by writing clear APIs and going to the other stakeholders and saying, okay, so in my case, for example, I built reputation systems at Amazon, and Amazon is very, very, very good at doing this because they have great service-oriented architecture. I had built reputation systems that we need customer image upload people needed to use. So I said, okay, I wrote down the APIs, I brought them to the customer image upload people, and I said, if you use these APIs, will this be sufficient? How many times do you think you'll call this API? What will the load be? And they came back and they said, this actually doesn't quite work for us because our load is going to be so much more than your load. We need to come up with a way to do this such that we don't have to hit your service every single time. They needed a caching layer. And so we talked about that, and it was exactly the right conversation, because the last thing you want to have is a situation in which you design everything, you build it, and you're like, yay, this will be great. It's just a few RPCs, and everything will be good. And then the next thing you know, your service is drowning and can't scale for the load that's coming in. Or you're not actually providing the right data. They don't actually have, say, a customer ID, so they can't join it up, and that means that you have to go rebuild your system so that you get a customer ID to work through the pipeline, that type of thing. So this is extremely useful, and I do think it's a best practice at Amazon. I think you see it less in companies where product planning and engineering are more stratified. By that I mean engineers can be a little territorial, product people can be a little territorial, everybody can be a little territorial, and so it's important to recognize that, just as, designers don't like engineers to draw, pretty pictures in Photoshop. Sometimes, engineers don't necessarily like marketing people to go writing API signatures and method signatures and so forth. So I think it's meaningful to do this. Your team has to understand what you're trying to do and why you're trying to do it. You are not trying to, and some teams are happy to have, people from outside the direct engineering organization contribute code or contribute tests. Others are not. Others are willing to have you suggest, maybe it looks something like this. And so it's best not to write, if you're going to write an API or a method signature, it's best not to do it in a real programming language. Do it in a fake programming language that you make up. And that way it's easiest to say, look, I'm actually not trying to tell you guys how to do this. I just think maybe this is a good way of communicating what we're trying to provide. And I think that level of specificity, just in the same way, I'm going to draw one more corollary, which is that when building mock-ups of what your UI should look like, always try to use real text. If you use like Latin, you'll see this lorem ipsum stuff, just to sort of fill things up. It'll look fine, but it won't actually expose what you have to tell the user. When you go to write the real text in the UI, it turns out you have to write, like, do these 3 things, that's a good sign that you should change your UI. Because you've given the user, like 3 big steps, and you should figure out a way to do it in 1 step. So it's a parallel to writing the APIs. Get very, very specific.
Yes, it's a different way of doing requirements, maybe a more agile way than just asking for requirements.
I think it kind of comes down to drawing a picture to some extent. APIs are pictures of systems in the same way that mockups are pictures of, user interfaces. And they help, it's just another way of helping ingest what is supposed to happen.
And my other question was the service-oriented architecture, which you mentioned, and which Amazon is famous for. You had some positives and some negatives to say about that. Is there a way to summarize your approach?
Well, I think what I would say is that overall, service-oriented architectures are great, and it's the exact way to go. There are a few challenges when things start getting complicated. You can run into things like service chaining. And I talk a little bit about that, and what service chaining is Andy, if you have a service and I have a service, and somebody else needs to get information from you, but before they get it from you, I have to process it. We get 1, 2, 3 steps that the systems have to work through. And so what this generates is latency that is the sum of all those steps. And that can be very painful. So you just have to be very careful to avoid that and to work your way around that. And there's various techniques for that. But overall, service-oriented architectures are great because they allow for compartmentalization. They allow you to change your service without me having to change my service, as long as we have good APIs. And that's so APIs become very, very, very important there. They also keep code bases smaller. They enable they enable services to scale as their demand scale and to use the right kind of systems. For example, you might have a system for doing text recognition, and that could be accelerated by running directly on the GPU, whereas somebody else might have a database-based system, and that needs a lot of disk space and a lot of RAM because it's got to keep a cache of the most recently used results. Well, those are very, very different hardware profiles. And by having smart systems that are well segmented, you can actually allocate the correct resources to the correct services. So service-oriented architectures are very nice for that purpose. The other thing that you need to look at is integration testing very carefully. Because there then end up being so many dependencies that are outside of a given service's scope, you end up doing things in your unit tests like mocking the other service. So you're going to provide me my data from a database. As a unit test, I'll mock that database returning some data so that I can run my unit tests. And this is a little technical in the weeds, but it's worth understanding what unit testing is, which is you test a small part of the software and make sure it works, and then you can run all those tests before you check in your code, which is great because you know that things don't break. But in this case, because we've got this service that we depend on, we had to create a fake one, a mock. It may be that your service has changed and my mock didn't change. So as far as I'm concerned, my code is great. So there's that level of interface where we have to make sure that we can run against either your production service, run a test against your production service and make sure things work, or make sure that, or more to the point, in addition to that, make sure that when your service changes, that our mocks change, and so on and so forth. And that requires a certain amount of diligence and preliminary sort of staging environments that are expensive and painful to maintain, but they're necessary because you can't catch everything in unit testing. You need functional testing before you roll things out.
There's some things that have been in the literature for a long time, and they're still not being done by the people who should be doing them. And I was very impressed. You cover a lot of different stages of projects in the book. You cover a lot of different things. And before we wrap up, I just wonder if there's anything else that you feel you should say.
Well, I think I might sort of bring something out from the introduction, which is that this business of shipping is really hard, and everybody involved in software does it. There are people that lead at different points and help ship at different points, but everybody is capable of helping make a product great by making the right decisions at the right point in time. The tech lead, I think, can do this better later and will be okay for right now, is providing critical judgment that nobody else in the team can provide. The designer that says, yeah, okay, we could get this down to 3 steps, but the vast majority of people are going to be able to understand it right now. We'll fix it later. Again, great. And the program manager who's making sure that everybody stays in lockstep as they move forward is critical to really getting something out the door. But it's hard. All this stuff is really hard. And there's a whole bunch of tricks that you'll learn along the way. And everybody will make the process their own, and every team makes a process their own. So there's not necessarily any one right way to do it. I do try to make things pretty, clear cut, because I'd rather have things. I'd rather have a way that you can try than wave my hands a lot. What I propose is one way. My hope is that everybody will incorporate these techniques and make them their own and build great software.
Well, thanks for keeping notes over all those projects you've worked on and offering this insight to us.
No, you're welcome.